Welcome to this talk on suffering, which forms part of a training day that was originally delivered in London entitled the Why series, where we were looking at the question of suffering from a variety of angles. Sharon Dirckx is a member of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics and one of its tutors. She's written and spoken extensively on this subject, most notably through her prize-winning book. We hope that this particular question will be of interest to you, as Sharon will be speaking about the subject of natural disasters. How do we understand them? Why do they occur? Do we understand this indeed as part of God's judgment, or is there another way of looking at it? It is our hope that as we explore this question in all of its different nuanced forms, that this particular presentation will shed light on a very old and thorny question.
Pleasure to be here and talk to you on a slightly different angle on the question of evil and suffering. A lot of people say, well, what about natural disasters? What about events that seem to be entirely out of our control? Surely we're not responsible for these. You know, our insurance policies protect us against acts of God. Is this what they are? How do we make sense of natural disasters? I don't know if you remember December the 26th in 2004, when we watched our TV screens in disbelief as a wall of water surged onto beaches in Thailand, Indonesia, and southern India, killing up to 230,000 people and destroying homes, entire families, and neighborhoods and livelihoods. And 1.74 million people were displaced, and the after effects of that are still being worked out. We could also look at Hurricane Katrina in 2005 that decimated parts of New Orleans and many other cities, leaving 1,833 dead and 600,000 displaced. We could call to mind the Japan earthquake of 2011 and tsunami, the devastation in Haiti in 2010, or Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, Japan and Ecuador in even just the last few weeks. How do we make sense of natural disasters such as these? And the questions don't stop there. What about the impact of disease and sickness? We've all, one way or another, encountered illness. I wonder, is there a person in the room that has not encountered cancer one way or another, either directly or indirectly? We see diseases such as dementia are on the rise as the age of our population increases. We've struggled with both of these things in our own family. I lost my father-in-law to cancer a few years ago, and my mother-in-law has dementia. These are real issues. These are live issues for me, and I'm sure that they are for you as well. Now, philosophers refer to this kind of suffering as natural evil. In other words, the evil that affects the natural world itself, either through geophysics in the case of natural disasters, or through our biology in the case of disease and sickness. Now, I'm going to start by looking at natural disasters, and I will draw in reference points to disease and sickness when there's something helpful that we can actually apply to disease and sickness as well. Firstly, some opening thoughts. If God doesn't exist, then surely it's all natural. There are no disasters as such. This is simply the way the world is. If there is no supernatural dimension, then we are left with a closed system of atoms and molecules and physical forces. And so earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, and diseases are simply the outworking of the laws of nature, cause and effect, and probability. To call them a disaster is to imply that something is wrong. But if God doesn't exist, then this is simply the way the world is. For example, there are 0.1 trillion kilometers of DNA in the human body, and there are 7 billion people on Earth. Surely by chance alone, it's going to go wrong, leading to some genetic diseases. You can explain some of this away purely by probability. This is just the way the world is. The late Christopher Hitchens, and best-selling author and atheist, was interviewed in 2011 on CNN about his diagnosis of terminal cancer of the esophagus, and he was asked whether, despite his atheism, he had been tempted to ask the question, why me? And he responded with this. He said, you can't avoid the question, however stoic you are. You can only bat it away as a silly one. Millions of people die every day. Everyone's got to go sometime. Now, this response is incredibly bleak, especially since Christopher Hitchens has since died. And yet his response is consistent with his atheism, with his naturalism. That actually, this is just the way the world is. Accidents happen. DNA makes mistakes. But if God doesn't exist, then this is just simply part of the natural order. There are no disasters to object to as such. And there is no point asking why, because there's no one to ask. But then, I don't know about you, but then I look at that and say, well, why do we cry out against the injustice of disasters that we observe and diseases that we see happening? Why was there a why question to be batted away? I think that we instinctively ask why because God exists, not because he doesn't. These questions don't send us further away from God. They point us towards him. Now, in terms of other opening thoughts, I want to say, what do we actually mean by a natural disaster? I want to say what is not a natural disaster. Famine, war, and mass migration of refugees fleeing violence and persecution are not natural disasters. They are a disaster. They may be a national disaster, but they are not a natural disaster. They have their root in greed, in corruption, in power struggles, and in moral evil rather than physical evil. By a natural disaster, we are talking about large-scale events caused by physical mechanisms in the world, such as earthquakes, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, tsunami, and so on. And I'm going to refer to them as natural events for now, and we can decide later whether they should be referred to as a disaster. So how can we begin to respond? Why natural disasters? Firstly, it's a wonder that life exists at all. It's important to remember that although natural events occur, the extent to which they occur on Earth seems to be within boundaries such that life is still possible. If we look at the planets around us, we see a different picture. Venus has 80% of its surface covered with volcanoes. Neptune and Jupiter have storms that call for a redefinition of the term extreme weather. Jupiter is most well known for its great red spot. This is an anticyclone larger than 2 Earths put together with an average temperature of minus 163 degrees Celsius. This storm is so large it consumes smaller ones, and it has been around for at least 400 years. On Venus and Jupiter and every other planet that we know of, life is untenable. Britain is well known for its variable weather. We love to talk about it. Here we are on the hottest day of the year, probably going to be sweltering a bit later. And we are quick to bemoan our conditions because there's so much to talk about, whether they're too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, too cloudy, too sunny. And when we consider, Brits, we bring an umbrella with us everywhere, don't we? Just in case it rains. I have taken an umbrella to the desert with me, just in case it rains. My friend said, Sharon, it's the desert. It will be a miracle if it rains here. We have so much to talk about in the weather, and yet when we consider the planets around us, our weather conditions, however variable they are, they seem to lie within limits such that life is still possible. And we need to be mindful of this bigger perspective as we look at natural disasters. Philosophers refer to it as fine-tuning. Even though our planet contains natural events that can claim lives, we also need to be mindful of a bigger perspective, that it is a wonder that life even exists at all. Now, the second thing that we can say is that natural events also create beauty. Geophysicists would say that the physical mechanisms behind natural events have contributed to much of the natural beauty that we enjoy. The mountains that we climb up in the summer and ski down in the winter have been formed with the riding up and the forcing down of tectonic plates against each other over evolutionary time or extremely long periods of time. Molten lava from volcanoes once cooled allows new land to form, and this is how the Hawaiian Islands have been formed. So natural events create beauty. The other thing we can say is natural events sustain life. These same natural events sustain and create life. Tectonic plate movement enables nutrients from the ocean floors and beneath the Earth's crust to be recycled back into the biosphere. Volcanoes enable pressure from beneath the Earth's crust to be released, and the soil at the root of a volcano is incredibly fertile. I don't know if you've ever watched these Italian cookery programs. There was one of a restaurant nestled in the crater of an extinct volcano, and the fruit and vegetables that they were growing were enormous and amazing because of the fertility of the soil around a volcano. We also know that flooding can be beneficial. The Nile floods every year and brings all kinds of nutrients to the local area through the soil. And in terms of disease and sickness, we can also apply this principle, these two things that I've just mentioned. You see, we can't speak to disease and sickness without first also recognizing how incredible the human body is. The human body is beautiful, and it is capable of incredible things. Do you know that human beings can outrun any other creature? Now, most of us have never run long enough to find out this fact or put it into practice. We can't run the fastest, we can run the longest. The Olympics that are about to happen in Brazil will remind us of the incredible things that humans are capable of. The body of an average adult contains an average of 50 trillion cells. There are 10 million chemical reactions per second per cell. So if you thought you were busy already, you definitely are now. And each cell contains 2 meters of tightly coiled DNA. If you were to stretch it out end to end, it would be enough to journey to the sun and back more than 300 times. The human body is incredible. And yet we also know that it's fragile and it's subject to disease. But this helps us to see that the question why natural disasters is not as straightforward as it might at first seem. Now, there are a number of positions held by Christians, and I'm going to highlight 2 here, but I'm aware that there are others. Firstly, some people will say that natural events are not evil in and of themselves. They only become a disaster when people die. You see, one view is that natural events are not intrinsically evil. In fact, some Bible verses suggest that natural events are a demonstration of God's majesty and sovereignty over nature. Psalm 104, verse 32 is an example of this when it talks about God looks at the earth and it trembles. And he touches the mountains and they smoke. Is that a reference to an earthquake and a volcano? And also Psalm 97, the mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. Is that a volcano? That is a pointer to the majesty of God in his created world. You see, people of this view would say natural events existed before the fall and will exist in heaven. And the impact of the fall is more that we have become vulnerable to them in several ways. One way that we've become vulnerable to them is that we ignore or we misread the signs of nature. Could it be that the earliest humans enjoyed an incredible closeness with God and also with the natural world? And they used to be able to recognize when an event was coming. Maybe they used to climb a cliff and watch a tsunami come in all of its majesty because they could tell, they could read the signs of nature and see that something extraordinary was going to happen. If we look at the animal world, and they are not arguably fallen in the same way that we are, they have a greater awareness of the natural signs than we do. Animals head for the hills before a tsunami is coming. Birds go quiet before a storm. Could it be that the fall hasn't damaged nature itself, but has damaged how humans interact with nature? And the second way that we've become vulnerable is through poverty and injustice. The number of deaths from natural events, if you compare when a natural event happens in a developing country compared with a developed country, you can see that the death toll in developing countries is several orders of magnitude greater than in a developed country. The death toll in Asia after the tsunami in 2004 was in the hundreds of thousands because many were living in makeshift houses, were living in poverty on the beaches. If you compare two earthquakes of similar severity, California in 1989 and Haiti in 2010 were both similar intensity, we see that 57 people died in California, whereas 230,000 people died in Haiti. Now, although we can make the case that people are not responsible for the natural event itself, I think it's unequivocal that poverty and injustice that are made worse by human greed and folly and an inability to care for the poor and build proper infrastructure and houses that can withstand earthquakes undoubtedly add to the death toll. And I think as Christians, we have a role to play in relieving poverty, in going to be, as Nabil said, I have that exact same phrase, being God's hands and feet in those situations. Now, the second position that people might hold, or might hold both of them together at the same time, is that natural events are themselves evil. That nature is incredibly beautiful, but there is also something wrong. And nature itself is broken because the human decision to turn away from God has dragged the whole of nature and our physical bodies along with it, and has introduced or made worse volcanic activity, tectonic plate movement, and all of those other things, as well as disease and sickness. In other words, the spiritual condition of humanity has impacted the entire natural world. We see glimpses of this when Adam is told by God that the ground is cursed because of his actions in Eden, and also in Romans through the Apostle Paul, Romans 8, that against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse and has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And there are a number of other verses that connect spiritual events with natural events, and the most notable that we see, the most spiritually significant event in the entire history of mankind, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, are both accompanied by an earthquake. Now, could it be that the effects of the cross are so far-reaching that they probe not only the very depths of the human soul, but also nature itself? And in some ways, when we think about why do these things happen, we can agree with some of what naturalists would say, actually, that DNA does make mistakes. There is a sense of cause and effect. If you live a certain way, you're going to end up with a certain health level and probability. But there's a deeper level of explanation needed. That's one level. There is a deeper level of explanation needed. And the Christian response would say disease and sickness also exist because there is something wrong. That spiritual brokenness has somehow led to physical brokenness, and everyone is affected. It's like our very biology is dragged along with it. And we possibly see hints of this when Eve is told in Genesis 3 that the physical act of childbirth will become much more painful. That the brokenness between humanity and God has affected our physical bodies. And this helps us. And this question has come up already, and it's such an important one. This helps us when we feel like we are being singled out for punishment, the sense of, why do I have to go through this? And somehow I have something to learn from this, that it seems like other people don't have to learn that lesson. Is God punishing me? And I think the simplest answer, as Amy and Nabil have already touched on, is not necessarily no. That disease and sickness affect us all as a general consequence of living in a world in which our very bodies are not as they should be, because there's a brokenness, and it pervades every area of life. We've already talked about Job. The book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. How incredibly comforting that the first thing to be documented is the most universal of human experiences, the experience of suffering. And the purpose of the book of Job, well, there are many purposes, but he is not being punished. It's far from that. He's righteous. He's right with God. The reason he is singled out for this is precisely because he is a servant of God and he is righteous. And yet we also see that there are spiritual reasons for his suffering. And this is an important point to say. Just because we're not being punished, just because we're not being singled out, that doesn't mean we rule out the spiritual entirely. It's like we've swung to the opposite end of the spectrum now. We used to attribute everything to the spiritual, and now we attribute everything to the physical. I think we are holistic beings who are body, mind, spirit, and there are all kinds of interactions that take place there. And I think modern medicine needs a sense of recapturing the interaction between the physical and the spiritual. There are lots of other things that we could say on this. What should even be our response? Is there anything we need to do to respond to natural disasters? I think that as people, as Christians, we are to play our part in relieving human suffering. Firstly, through science and medicine and technology. These are God-given. Medicine finds its roots in the Judeo-Christian faith. You know, the first people to start caring for people precisely because they didn't deserve their suffering. They weren't to blame for it. Were the Christians in the Greco-Roman world. The first hospitals were started by Christians. We are to play our part. If you are a doctor here, you are God's hands and feet to help relieve suffering in a partial way now. If you are a nurse or an aid worker, an NGO worker, through science, medicine, and technology, and through bringing justice for the poor. And interestingly, the reasons that we do this can be very wide and varied. Someone that doesn't believe in God would say, you need to make the most of this life and live well because this is the only life you get. The Christian says, you do it because this isn't the only life you get. That there is a life to come. There is life ahead of us. In the meantime, we are God's hands and feet because God has not remained distant or indifferent to our suffering. He draws close to people in their troubles. We love because he first loved us. And this is what it really comes down to. That God is not indifferent to your suffering or to mine. And he intervenes, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, through the hands and feet of others. And he doesn't always give us answers. He doesn't always give us a prognosis or a diagnosis. But what he does give us is himself. He says, you are never alone. You are never alone. I can't give you all the answers, but I give you myself. And I have taken your suffering into myself. That's what Isaiah means. He took up our infirmities. He has taken our physical suffering into himself and taken it to the grave with him and left it there and gone through death and out the other side, so that whatever pit you find yourself in, it's never too deep for him to pull you out and put you back on your feet again. And the Christian hope is that one day we will be fully healed. There is sometimes healing in this life, sometimes partial healing in this life. But there's a misunderstanding that as Christians, we're waiting to go to heaven. We will die and go to heaven. The Bible does not say that. The Bible says heaven has come down to us in the person of Jesus Christ, and it will be fully established one day. But we are not going to disappear and be ghost-like figures floating around in some weird existence. We get a new physical body that is a spiritual body and a physical body. And everything will be made new. And maybe we'll be able to watch a tsunami come in, or maybe we'll be able to go and just watch a volcano in all its majesty. Who knows? But there will be a new heaven and a new earth that will be every bit as physical as this world that we find ourselves in. And one day, God will transform our broken bodies to be like his glorious body. And I finish with when Paul talks about this in Corinthians chapter 5. So it will be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. Thank you for listening.
Sharon, the questions have been coming in, and I hope you're happy to take a few now for a few minutes. Receiving 36 votes was this question: do you think modern medicine can now explain some of the things that we see in the Bible? For example, demonic possession might now be described as epilepsy.
Thank you. I think this is a great question, and I think that there are a number of different things that we can say. Again, I think partly the reason the question is asked now is because we like to purely think of things in terms of the physical, and if we now have a mechanism that goes behind something that we have fully explained it, I think that the Bible teaches us, and the Christian worldview is that we are holistic beings, that we are physical and we are spiritual. And there are all kinds of reasons why we might suffer that are beyond just the physical. And I think we could speak to things like unforgiveness or holding bitterness in our heart can come out through our physical health, or extreme grief can affect our physical sickness. And I think we don't want to kind of diminish that and say, actually, there are all kinds of impacts of the spiritual on the physical, and we need to reclaim a sense of understanding of this. And I think that the demonic is also something that can't be diminished, and sometimes an illness that is demonic can manifest as something that looks like an illness that has an explanation in modern medicine. The difference is to get to heal and deliver and set free, that it looks differently. I think that epilepsy and demon possession are two different things. I think that demon possession still happens today just as much as it happened in first century Palestine. Epilepsy needs treating with anti-epileptics, and it is a genuine condition. Demon possession needs the gifts of people in church to pray and see a person delivered and set free. And what we see is the symptoms of what looks like epilepsy go. entirely and often instantaneously. And we see examples of this both in history and in the present day. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Sharon, there was a video with Stephen Fry describing, in answer to a journalist's questions, how could God have created things like parasitic worms? And a couple of the questions that came in from the cards were along this line. What would you say in reply to that kind of a question?
Thank you. Perhaps some of you saw the YouTube video, the interview of Stephen Fry on Irish national TV a couple of years ago with Gay Byrne, and he was asked, Stephen, suppose it's all true and you find yourself at the pearly gates, what will you say to God at that point? And Stephen Fry essentially goes on a rant, and essentially bone cancer in children, what's that all about? And there are insects whose prime aim is to burrow into the eyes of children and eat outwards from the eye. And this is a really powerful thing, and as I listen to him, I see this is not just an intellectual question that he has, and I often do play this clip before I speak to suffering. The first thing to say is to come back to one of the points that I made, that actually if God doesn't exist and we simply live in a world where things do what they do, that's not grounds to for our angst as to why it should happen. You could argue that, on the one hand, we say that we're determined and we're just purely our DNA, working itself out. And that insect didn't know it was going to end up in a child's eye. It's just eating away at whatever material it happens to find itself in. There's nothing right or wrong about that. That's just DNA dancing to its music. But obviously, as Christian, we would say something different. I think one angle that it's important to say that another way that the fall has made us vulnerable to diseases like this is the contribution of poverty. You see, the eye itself is beautiful and amazingly intricate. I don't know if you've ever studied the eye. I did it at school, and there was a jar of them that followed us around the room, whatever we did. And the insect is also beautiful. If you ever looked at various types of insects and under, a microscope, amazing that even as you get smaller and smaller, it's still incredibly beautiful. And there is structure there, and there are mechanisms there. The two on their own are not evil. It's when they come into contact with each other that problems arise. Why do insects even get the opportunity to burrow into the eyes of children? I suggest the problem is more rooted in poverty than in medicine. Clean water can solve so many of the problems. Malaria is still the biggest world killer. If we were to solve that and put our money into that, we might see a lot of the disease and sickness relieved in our world. So I would want to root it more in poverty. Thank you.
Sharon, two questions I'm going to add together here. A question about the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we read about God's judgment on the Egyptians where plagues were sent. With that in mind, does that mean that natural disasters can be a sign of God's judgment with 38 votes? And then a bit further down, there's another one which is asking about, does our sin, 23 votes now, does our sin have a part to play in the causes of natural disasters? So nearly 60 votes for that one. Okay,
thank you. This is a great question, and it's so interesting, isn't it, how... that we often, I think, want to apportion blame in some way. And there have been all kinds of inflammatory things said by different leaders about why God might have allowed a certain natural event to occur on a particular region because of some sort of a sin they have committed. We see very briefly Jesus responding to two types of suffering that seem of a larger scale that can possibly help us here. I'm just going to read some verses from Luke 13. It says, verses 1 to 5, "Now there were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Jesus answered, 'Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? I tell you no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. Or those 18 who died when the tower in Shiloh fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than all the others in Jerusalem? I tell you no, but unless you repent, you too will all perish.'" You see, we see a moral evil committed by Pilate had some Christians killed and their blood was mixed with the sacrifices, and we see a potentially a natural disaster with this tower falling on people. Now, we don't know why the tower collapsed. We don't know whether it was due to an earthquake or because it was poorly built. But Jesus, either way, he says that these people have not sinned in to any greater degree than you. But these events, when we're an observer to the suffering of someone else, this is a reminder to us of the brevity of our lives and of the reality of perishing apart from Christ. They're a reminder to get ourselves right with God because perishing is real. And a reminder that they're not God's judgment. This is not God's judgment, but judgment is coming. And one day we will all answer to God for how we've lived and how we've behaved. And I'd love to say that Stephen Fry will have a chance to rant, but actually I think it's more likely that God will ask questions of us and we will answer to him.
Thank you, Sharon. One of the questions that was voted for was, how can thousands of innocent people dying in tsunamis and epidemics and droughts be about fulfilling God's plan, a mechanism for him to be glorified? I suppose in some ways that's the question you were speaking to. So maybe you could summarize some of the sort of key ideas for us in your answer as you speak to that.
Okay.
Can these just be blamed on our free will?
I think that, thank you for the question. I think this is a very interesting one. And I think that, again, as Amy has already said, that there is a sense that sometimes we suffer at the hands of other people, and free will is plays a role. Sometimes it's our free will, sometimes it's a misuse of someone else's free will. But I think that we also have to take into account the effects of poverty and injustice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Would you mind thanking Sharon for her talk? Thank you.